And welcome, we are live here now. This is the modern wrong world made late. I am your host and moderator, Mike Church. I'm also the founder and the creator of the Modern Wrong World Made Right series, which we do on behalf of you, the listening audience, so that you may know that the heresies and apostasies that you live amongst are just that. Heresies and apostasies. And that we may correct the erroneous thinking that has led to them. Our series includes Calvin was wrong, Luther was wrong, and in today's episode, Darwin was wrong. So we will go right to the Dude Maker Skype hotline, and we will bring in Chris Ferrara, who is the resident expert and host of the Darwin Was Wrong series. We've already conducted Darwin Was Wrong Part 1 and Darwin Was Wrong Part 2. This is Darwin Was Wrong Part 3. And as I said when we were exchanging emails, I wanted to provide the audience a little bit of the history behind the evolutionist and behind how it was that Charles Darwin was able to hoodwink and con the remaining shreds of Christianity that were left in England. And then, of course, this spread like the proverbial wildfire throughout the rest of the civilized world. How was he able to do this? And were there other players that were involved in this, with the theory of evolution becoming now accepted almost as, well, it is. It's dogma. It is its own religion, and it has its own dogmas.
Well, by the turn of the 20th century, it had already become established as a kind of religion. And this was according to the spirit of the age, the conquering spirit of the age, which is essentially a massive effort to remove any connection between civil society and specifically the Catholic Church and Christianity in general, to overthrow the Genesis account of special creation of man and woman and the creation of the universe by God, and replace it with something that could allow one to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist, as the saying goes. So this was basically the creation narrative for the tyrants of academia, who even then were advancing a secular notion of the real and man's existence and replacing God with evolution. So, for example, we have a quote in this excellent study by Michael Chabarek, Catholicism and Evolution, by a Harvard professor by the name of Thomas Dwight, writing in 1911, early on, as this dogma was being established. And he said, again, a Harvard professor, the tyranny of the zeitgeist in the matter of evolution is overwhelming to a degree of which outsiders have no idea. Not only does it influence, as I must admit that it does in my own case, our manners of thinking, but there is the oppression, as in the days of the terror, meaning the terror of the French Revolution. How very few of the leaders of science dare to tell the truth concerning their own state of mind. How many of them feel forced in public to do a lip service to a cult they do not believe in? That was in 1911.
Wow.
And as we know from the situation in academia today, if you question the dogma of evolution, your career as an academic is either over or will never get started. You'll be denied tenure. You'll be kicked out of the university. The film Expelled is an excellent illustration of this problem. And very movingly, it ends with this tableau of three Jewish intellectuals standing in front of the Berlin Wall, which symbolizes the wall around this dogma, this impenetrable wall. And they're lamenting the fact that no one can penetrate this wall in academia because it isn't science, it's a dogma.
It is dogma.
And as a dogma, it's self-authenticating. It's as if there's a kind of, I don't know, I guess you'd call it a revelation. This is the revelation that they bring to the world, that all things are the result of evolution, that every organism on the face of the earth descended from one common ancestor, which would have to be a single cell billions of years ago, The claim is ridiculous on its face, and yet that is their substitute for the creation narrative of Genesis. And it is, as such, a religion.
And do you know what's fascinating about that, or perhaps coincidental about that, and maybe they haven't considered this, is that if we read the book of Genesis and we accept the creation story as a literal work from the mouth of God through the pen or the chisel of Moses or Noah or whoever it was that wrote that portion of the book of Genesis.
Moses was the principal inspired author, as the Catholic Church
principal inspired author. We would then accept we accept it there where that we have founding parents, Adam and Eve. So
we have to.
Well, actually, we have a founding parent because it was Adam, and then God went, I'm thinking maybe I'm going to create Eve for him. So we have a common ancestor. But our common ancestor and then common ancestors are rejected as being some sort of a fairy tale, while their common ancestor, which is a single-cell protozoa or amoeba, that's the face of man. And they say that our argument, or that the creation argument, the argument pursued from the truth and from the revealed truth, is ridiculous. How in the world did people come to believe this?
Well, as I said, it's a dogma. And speaking of the first protozoan, or the first unicellular ancestor of all living things, they can't even get to first base. They can't explain the emergence of the first cell with a nucleus and its incredible complexity. A single cell is a manufacturing facility with coded instructions for the creation of protein components. The cellular processes going on are fueled by the mitochondrion. And no one has any idea how even a single cell of this sort could have originated. The whole thing is a myth. It's a creation myth. Now, for Protestant listeners, it should be stressed that the Catholic Church has never officially embraced the theory of evolution. There's no reference to it in the New Catechism. John Paul II might have made some remarks which tend to favor the idea that it's more than a hypothesis, although that speech was not actually given by him. It was written for him by someone else. Officially speaking, the Catholic Church holds essentially to creationism. It is an article of faith that God specially created Adam, and as Pope Leo XIII insisted in his encyclical on marriage, no one may doubt that while Adam was sleeping, God in a miraculous fashion drew Eve from Adam. I suppose you could call this a kind of divine cloning of woman from man. No one may doubt this, because that is why the first couple were of one flesh, and why marriage is two people in a covenant with God becoming one flesh. Leo said no one may doubt this. Father Brian Harrison has pointed out that the creation of Eve from Adam is a teaching of the ordinary and infallible magisterium, meaning that the Church is infallible when she always and everywhere teaches the same thing down through the centuries. The Church can't be wrong on a constant teaching, for if she could be wrong on a constant teaching, then Christ himself would have been a liar when he said he would be with his church all days unto the consummation of the world. And that teaching has never been refuted by anyone in the Vatican today, by any pope, by any catechism, by any encyclical whatsoever. So essentially, the Catholic Church holds to creation, the creation narrative of Genesis, even if obviously some things in that account are metaphorical, such as God walking with Adam in the garden. Obviously, God wasn't walking around as the person does on 2 feet with Adam in the garden, but was in direct communication with him because Adam had an intimate relationship with God like no other man has had since. So that's where the Catholic Church really stands when you look at it, that God created heaven and earth and all of the creatures on earth ex nihilo. The creation of all things ex nihilo from nothing is a defined dogma of the Catholic faith, defined as such by the Lateran Council. So on the essential points of the Genesis account, the Catholic Church, officially speaking, holds to the creationist so-called narrative. Now, is there room for some microevolution within kinds such that the kinds give rise to different varieties? Is there limited speciation? For example, the different species of dogs, the different species of flowering plants.
Right.
Obviously, there's room for a limited amount of change within the genetic potential of organisms. and the church doesn't deny that. What the church does deny officially is that Adam is the product of evolution from apes or ape-like ancestors, and that Eve was likewise the product of evolution. Because if you hold to that, then you have to hold to the error of polygenism. Because evolution could not have happened just once with Adam, if it happened at all. There had to be a number of first men and a number of first women. But if there were a number of first men and women that arose from an evolutionary process, who committed the original sin? Some of them might have, and others would not have. So there would be descendants of these first men and women who did not sin, in which case you don't need the redemption. Because there is no real original sin. There's only a certain line of people that might have inherited the taint of original sin from one of the first humans of sin. But the rest of humanity would be free from it. So the entire basis for the Christian religion collapses in a heap once we admit the error of polygenism, which, by the way, Pope Pius XII said Catholics may not hold. So to the Protestant listeners, know that as well. Pope Pius XII, in his encyclical Humani Generis, said Catholics are not permitted to hold the opinion that after Adam there existed on the earth true men who did not descend directly from him. Period. That has never been changed.
This is The Modern Wrong World Made Right. This is Darwin Was Wrong, Episode 3, our special guest today. As always, when we discuss Charles Darwin and the theory or the concept of evolution, is Christopher Ferrara, he the author of Liberty, the God That Failed. And I tried to get some copies of your other book into the Founders Trade Post, and apparently they actually are in short supply and have to be made. So
it's available now.
And that is the
back
book.
In stock, so you can grab it.
And that is the book.
The Great Facade.
The Great Facade.
F-A-C-A-D-E, second edition. And that's relevant to this discussion because the Great Facade, especially in the second edition, which covers the pontificate of Pope Francis, in the Great Facade we show how the spirit of the age, not in an official way, but in the attitudes of churchmen, has penetrated the church itself.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the crisis that Scripture itself foretells, at least the beginning of a loss of faith and the salt losing its savor, even in the Catholic Church. And everyone should be worried about that, because if the Church loses its savor and is trampled underfoot, to paraphrase our Lord's warning, then what will be left of the bulwark of morality? For the Catholic Church alone has stood fast on moral questions, and evolution ties into that, because if man is the product of evolution and not the product of divine creation, then God disappears from the history of man, and practical atheism enters. Morality is ultimately destroyed. So evolution is designed to do precisely that, to unseat God and replace God with the creed of secular humanism. So this book explores how after the Second Vatican Council, the modern world, to which the Church supposedly opened in this generous gesture of welcoming and accentuating the positive,
Okay.
the spirit of the world penetrated the Church. And so we see this immense liberalization going on in the Catholic Church, and I trace the course of that development. I co-authored the book, but the second edition has about 250 pages of new material, bringing it up to date. The first edition appeared back in 2002, and this one, 13 years later, brings the process up to date. And I tell you, the process is quite alarming, because Francis has made some clear indications that he is, again, unofficially, but clearly so, an evolutionist. He simply presumes that evolution is a fact. He hasn't imposed that opinion on the Church, but he's a liberal Jesuit from the 1970s, formed in the 70s in the Jesuit seminary, and he has adopted hook, line, and sinker the nonsensical evolutionism of Teilhard de Chardin, whom he cited favorably, by the way, in Laudato Si, in one of the footnotes. The first time that fraud, de Chardin, has found his way into a papal encyclical, other than to be condemned by the Pope. Now he's cited with approval. But again, it's a footnote in a document on ecology whose magisterial, that is, teaching authority, is certainly up for grabs. No one really knows what to make of that document.
844-5-CRUSADE, our telephone number on the Modern Wrong World Made Right. Chris Ferrara is our special guest here. Let's go back to the beginning here of where Darwin began. Can you say, from what you have researched and what you have written about this, When Darwin began his exploration of the origins of species, did he set out to actually divine or to create a new explanation for how life began? Or was there an event that happened that caused the transformation or caused him to then formulate this, what we know today as the theory of evolution?
Well, I can't say that I'm an expert on the life of Darwin, but I do know from reading that he definitely set out to disprove the traditional account of divine creation while paying lip service to the existence of a creator. And of course, those who were waiting for such a thing to come along elevated Darwin to prominence and made him a virtual demigod of his whole new look at reality, at the origin of man and the origin of everything. He was their savior, a child, and the child is born. In the city of Kent, unto us a child is born. Mm-hmm. And it was Darwin with his new explanation for the origin of man and the origin of all species. And so he definitely intended to unseat the traditional creationist account, but those who seized upon his theory took it to the ultimate extreme. Now, Darwin himself knew nothing of genetics, next to nothing. At that time, Gregor Mendel, a Catholic, by the way, a monk, was examining genetics and devising his observations into a set of genetic laws which demonstrated that there were actually laws governing the reproduction of species and the exchange of genetic information. And these laws tended to show the fixity of species. There were species barriers that could not be transgressed. So early on, genetics was undermining the vitality of Darwin's rather primitive hypothesis. I say primitive because genetics is revealed to be almost ludicrously primitive. He knew nothing about the difference between germ cells and somatic cells. He was still beholden to the superstition that somehow, according to Lamarck's hypothesis, environmental stressors could change the body in response to the stressors, and that these changes could be passed on through somatic cells. He didn't realize that reproduction took place in germ cells with a set of genetic instructions, and and in humans and other organisms that reproduce the way humans do, the process involves a combination of genetic information from both parents. He knew nothing of any of this. Now, since then, we have the synthetic theory, which attempts to incorporate the findings of genetics into Darwin's original hypothesis. But genetics itself confounds the idea that there could have been small changes conserved by natural selection that would produce a new organism.
Well, I was just going to say, just from what we just learned in the early moments here of Darwin Was Wrong, Part 3, part of the Modern Wrong World Made Right series here. Number one, that the actual study of genetics at the time of Darwin showed that there were barriers in between species jumping, using genetic material to jump from one species to the next. And secondly, that the process by which the information is exchanged is not conducive to the way that Charles Darwin said that the origin of species or the theory of evolution would take place. I'll tell you what, Christopher, I'll hold that thought. We will take our first break here, and we will come back. We have two more segments to go here on Darwin Was Wrong, Part 3. I am your host, Mike Church. This is our continuing series, The Modern Wrong World Made Right, here on the Veritas Radio Network Crusade Channel, and we'll be right back right after this.
You're fading in and out.
All right, we continue now with our second segment of Part 3 of Darwin Was Wrong, part of the Veritas Radio Network and the Crusade channels, the modern wrong world made right. With all the errors of modernity and all the errors of the modern world and all the philosophies and the philosophers that made this possible, we deconstruct it and go back to the source to reveal the original errors and to correct them and to give you the ammunition you need to correct your friends, correct your family, and to correct your own thinking when it is in error or when it is incorrect about the things that we're talking about here, especially when it comes to the matter of evolution, which my special guest, Chris Ferrara, who is on our Dude Maker hotline here for Darwin Was Wrong Part 3, Brother Francis Maloof, the great philosopher and teacher of Philosophia Perennis, said in his analysis of the modern philosophers in his course on Philosophia Perennis that of all the heresies and all the heretics and all the errors that were committed by Kant and Hegel and Nietzsche and Locke and all the rest of them, that the king of all the heresies and the king of all the errors was Darwin. That no one did more damage to man's thinking and man's thinking about the revealed truth than Charles Darwin. Would you concur?
Oh, absolutely. And let's explain that a bit, because when you posit the principle that all things are the result of evolution, living things to begin with, you destroy the very concept of distinctions between one thing and another. Because if all things are evolving, then no thing is one thing and that thing only. Man himself is evolving. He could be something else in 100 million years. All creatures are evolving. There are no real fixed species. One thing is always in the process of becoming another. And that theory carries over into philosophy and theology. So philosophical truths are subjected to the principle of evolution. Truth evolves. Of course, the claim that truth evolves is held not to evolve, which is always a fallacy involved in any attempt to depart from the perennial philosophy. You're asserting with equal certitude the very thing that you accuse the perennial philosophy of doing unjustly, in other words, an absolute truth. And then, of course, theology is subjected to evolution, so that dogmas evolve. And this is the essence of modernism, condemned by Pope St. Pius X, the evolution of dogma. Oh, yes, the words might be the same. We haven't changed the words, but the meaning is different. We understand dogma differently today than we did 100 years ago. Now, once life on Earth is subject to evolution and is constantly changing, and philosophy, philosophical truth, is subjected to evolution, and even the theological revelations of God himself are subjected to evolution, everything is in flux. Nothing is certain, and morality collapses along with everything else, because morality, of course, must evolve, along with theology, philosophy, and living things. That's why it is the mother of all heresies, in a sense.
And it makes sense that it would be the mother of all heresies and that it would have such great impact because, as you state, or as you say, if you can undermine that the creator and the creation, and if you can get people to actually start thinking that, well, he wasn't really there, and there is no starting point other than the starting point that we fictitiously surmise happened 3 billion years, and then it changes, and then it's 4 billion years. Then you have elevated the ability of man to discover something above what man is blessed with his intellect, which is the ability to understand, to comprehend, and then to surrender and his free will to, and to conform his free will to reality and to the revealed truth of reality.
And this is nothing new, Mike, and this is an old heresy, a philosophical heresy, if you will. It goes all the way back to the sophists of Plato's time, who insisted that everything is in flux, that the idea that there are fixed natures is an illusion, and so this heresy is brought forward in Darwin's theory of evolution to the biological world, and then it returns with a vengeance in the world of philosophy and in the world of theology. And this was one of the things that Pope St. Pius X feared the most at the turn of the 20th century. And that is why he prescribed in the Catholic Church the oath against modernism, one of the principal features of which is that a priest or theologian or any kind of instructor in Catholic theology would have to swear, take an oath, that he does not accept the idea that dogmas evolve, that they change their meaning over time. That very idea attacks the foundations of our religion itself, and its preponderance in the church today among so many churchmen, the reason the Catholic Church is in crisis, and it's the reason, of course, that Protestant denominations, the mainstream denominations, have long since collapsed on moral issues. Now we have a threat to see the same thing happen in the Catholic Church, although there could never be, because of the promises of Christ himself, an official change in church teaching, as we've seen in other denominations. There could still be a softening of adherence to teaching on the part of individual churchmen, and that's what we're witnessing now.
Now let's go back to the beginning of when Darwin first concocts this theory, and then others began to try and experiment with it, and then began to apply it. It's a number of decades after Darwin concocts this that the first serious scientific efforts are made in opposition to it, where men that are actually men of science begin to go, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense, and this doesn't work. Now, in the last segment, you talked a little bit about the Jesuit who was experimenting and who was beginning to start to formulate these rules of genetics and how genetic information would be transferred from one creature to the next. Now, if we fast forward a couple more decades, can you tell me a little bit, and we talked about this in part 2 of Darwin Was Wrong, but I don't think we got into to flesh it out entirely. Can you tell me a little bit about the work of the Frenchman, de Grassi, and what was it, or who was he, and why was he inspired to pick this particular subject up, and what did he discover after he began his inquiry?
Yeah, I was referring then to Pierre-Paul Grasset.
Grasset.
He was at one time the president of the French Academy of Science. He was an avowed evolutionist. He believed in the theory of evolution. He wrote a book called The Evolution of Living Organisms, published in 1977 by a subsidiary of Harcourt Brace Jovanovich in London, San Francisco, and New York. A very important book, difficult to get now because it's out of print. And the thesis of his book was that Darwinism, the idea that all living things could have emerged from small adaptations conserved by natural selection, in other words, copying mistakes in the genetic code, was simply preposterous. He rejected it, root and branch. He said that there must be other explanations, some kind of finality operating in organisms that hasn't been detected yet, because there are just too many things that are impossible to explain in terms of small changes conserved by natural selection.
Okay.
The interrelationship between organisms in terms of genetic changes and morphological changes shows that any kind of serious change in an organism's body plan would have to involve multiple simultaneous adaptations resulting from multiple simultaneous mutations, somehow all interrelated to form a new trait. He said this is ludicrous. It just can't happen that way. So there must be some kind of internal logic. He did not posit divine intervention, but some kind of internal logic, some hidden law of evolution that determines these variations among living things to produce markedly different body plans and different orders and classes and families and all the different elements that we see in the animal kingdom which differentiate the different areas of living organisms from one another and remain such throughout evolutionary time. In fact, he himself goes through a systematic analysis of the progress of evolution and concludes that for tens of millions of years there hasn't been any evolution, but only variations within species, a limited sort of speciation. And he goes through the periods of evolution, and I'm quoting from page 70 of his book, and he says the genesis of the phyla, the basic body plans among the organisms, stopped in the Ordovician age. The Ordovician age was about 485 million years ago. And then he says that the classes of animals within the phyla ceased evolving in the Jurassic period. Jurassic period was about 201 million years ago. And then he goes on to say that the orders stopped evolving in the Paleocene or Eocene era, and that was some 65 million or 66 to 56 million years ago. And so since then, he says, there was adaptation. We see speciation of certain varieties, but all within the basic plan. The changes are minor. So he essentially said evolution is a one-way process that apparently has stopped. And of course, that's what we see, isn't it? Evolution has mysteriously ended. You see articles in evolutionary periodicals about the question whether human evolution has stopped. Oh man, it's not evolving into anything else. It's manifest. There might be differences between different regions, differences in hair color, skin tone, musculature, stature, and so forth, but all of them are men. And it's the same with all of the other animals in the animal kingdom. They remain what they have always been. Now, evolutionists are desperate to explain this away. For example, they refer to living fossils when they find some relic that was supposed to have been replaced through the evolutionary process eons ago. Oh, it's still alive. How do they explain that? Well, this is just a relic, a living relic. And there are so many conundrums in the theory, one almost doesn't know where to begin. But I would start with Darwin's admission that if it could be shown that an organism or a trait could not have evolved through numerous successive slight modifications, he admits, my theory would absolutely break down. So if there's a complex trait in nature that could not have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, Darwin himself admitted his theory would break down. But that's all of nature, Mike. Nature abounds in such complexities.
Right.
We could talk for weeks, months, years, and just pick anything at random. I have a few counterfactuals which show that it's absolutely impossible that the trait or the organism in question could have evolved through successive slight modifications conserved by natural selection. I mean, we talked about the monarch butterfly. Let's look at that, for example. You start off with a caterpillar, spends most of its life devouring leaves. Then, all of a sudden, it decides to attach itself with a pad to a branch. It forms a chrysalis around itself. It's the hard body of the organism. It proceeds to dissolve itself, or most of itself, within the chrysalis. And then it reassembles itself into what ultimately becomes a butterfly. And then in the case of the monarch butterfly, it flies south for the winter because it can't survive in the place where it was generated during the cold weather. And then it returns north. And the whole process is repeated over and over again. Now, is there anyone who seriously believes that this incredible method of total metamorphosis for reproduction could have evolved through small successive modifications of some original organism? What do the evolutionists say when confronted with something like the monarch butterfly? Well, they say it's a mystery. Of course it's a mystery. They have no explanation for it.
Well, how can
the only possible explanation is that the butterfly was the way it was from the very beginning.
That's right. I was going to say, how can it be a mystery when you guys are, I mean, your whole purpose of your endeavor is to explain away the great mystery, which is certain things have been revealed to us, and we can either accept them or deny them. The rest of them remain kind of a mystery and mysterious. And most of us are content with the knowledge that, okay, well, some things maybe are just supposed to remain mysterious and are not going to be or are not supposed to be known. But just the fact that we use the term mystery and that they say it's a mystery, as in they are failing in their ability to be able to explain it, or they cannot. We say mystery, and we don't think of that as a failure. We think that as completion of a part of the plan. How ironic is that?
Well, obviously there's no explanation for the evolution of the butterfly. It's an absolute stumper, and it's one of a multitude of examples in nature. All of nature basically screams against this ridiculous idea that beginning with a single cell through a series of incredibly fortunate accidents, every living thing you see now somehow evolved. Through copying mistakes, which is basically what a mutation is, conserved somehow by natural selection. Now, where metamorphosis is concerned, this is typical of how evolutionists reason, and it's the fallacy of the implicit preface, otherwise known as begging the question. So you look at an article in Scientific American about insect metamorphosis, and there isn't just the monarch butterfly, but the vast majority of insect species that evolve through this incredible process of metamorphosis. They all metamorphose with different techniques, but they go through the same stages where a pupa ultimately becomes the fully fledged adult, but in the meantime is able to feed itself, whereas before this development, so they claim, the insect gave birth to little replicas of itself, which were sustained by the parent. Somehow the little replicas became larvae instead and were able to sustain themselves and self-feed themselves in the process of transforming themselves into an adult.
Sure they did.
Confronted with this mystery, here's what Scientific American says. However metamorphosis evolved, the enormous numbers of metamorphosing insects on the planet speak for its success as a reproductive strategy. See what they've done? They've assumed that evolution occurred. This is the fallacy of the implicit premise.
Right,
we don't know how they evolved,
right,
but the fact that there are so many of them means they must have evolved.
Right, they haven't proven anything. They just said, well, yeah, since we know that evolution occurred. No, you don't know that evolution occurred. You could say that coconut occurred. And not call it evolution. You could call it devolution if you wanted to. You could call it improvement. Regardless, you haven't proved anything.
Yeah, exactly. But that's just one counterfactual. Look anywhere at nature. Let's take things at random. Look, beavers, for example. Now, these are creatures that are communal in nature. They construct elaborate dams with lodges inside. They construct little storage areas under the water for the storage of food. They actually elongate canals by digging them so that more water can come into the area where they're building the dam. They cooperate with absolute precision in the construction of dams that even naval engineers have studied with amazement, using those techniques themselves for the construction of dams. Now, how in heaven's name could whatever the ancestors to the beavers were have gradually evolved a form of communal behavior that involves dam building, the digging of canals, the construction of lodges, underwater storage facilities, and the like? The very claim is ridiculous on its face. They have no explanation for this. Obviously, the beavers were created precisely as they are to do precisely what they do. There's no way that kind of closely coordinated communal behavior, intricate engineering techniques, and so forth could have been the result of accidental mutations conserved by natural selection. It is a fairy tale, Mike.
And it's a fairy tale that has had disastrous consequences, as we talked about in segment one of this presentation on Darwin Was Wrong, episode 3 or part 3. Tell you what, we'll take our time out here and come back with our final segment here on Darwin Was Wrong, part 3. When we return, I would like to go to a subject that was put forward by a listener of this show that had heard Darwin Was Wrong, part 1, and challenged you to try and prove scientifically your facts, and basically accuse you and I of constructing a fairy tale. And you responded to him, and with the challenge of, well, how do you account for the genetic makeup and the genetic requirement of what it takes to make a strand of DNA, and then how the strand of DNA is then used as the blueprint for the life. And then he retorted about something with the well, we can explain that from the RNA. And then you explain back to him, where did the RNA come from? I think this is a fascinating scientific part of the conversation that would be great to have to kind of flesh out the scientific argument. And we'll do that, but we'll do that in the final segment of this installment of Darwin Was Wrong. Chris Ferrara is our special guest. And Chris, if you'll hold on for one more segment, we'll come back and we will finish this fascinating topic up here, or this edition of Darwin Was Wrong, episode 3, part of the ongoing series here that is exclusive to the Veritas Radio Network and the Crusade channel, The Modern Wrong World Made Right. We'll be right back with our final segment of Darwin Was Wrong, episode 3. Okay, welcome back. This is the final and concluding episode of Darwin Was Wrong, Episode 3, part of the Modern Wrong World Made Right, our ongoing series exclusive here to the Veritas Radio Network and the Crusade channel. And our special guest on the Dude Maker Hotline is Chris Ferrara, who has been with us from the beginning of the Darwin Was Wrong series. Chris, give the folks listening at home and on the streaming download tape delay a little bit of background about how you began to cover this, because you've written extensively about this for the Remnant magazine and for the Remnant newspaper and some other publications as well.
Well, I got into it because as a lawyer, I have a finely developed baloney detector. And when I see a bad argument, I'm inclined to make it my day's work, or my grand obsession in this case, to refute it. And there is no weaker argument than the argument that all things on the earth resulted from descent with modification from a single cell eons ago. And it doesn't pass the smell test, just as a matter of common sense. It's so counterintuitive that I made it my business to demonstrate to people the obvious about how counterintuitive it is. And all you have to do is, as Darwin admitted, if you descend to details, he says it's very difficult to show that one species has ever given way to another, and that there has ever been a crossing of the species barrier through his imaginary process of small adaptations to conserve a natural selection. So, again, what we're doing in the previous segment is what everyone should do. Take a look at nature, pick anything almost at random, and try to come up with a plausible evolutionary explanation for it. And the problem begins, as you noted in the previous segment, with DNA itself. It's a classic chicken and egg dilemma, because DNA depends on DNA synthesizes proteins, or directs the synthesis of proteins, but DNA can't function without the existence of proteins. And so the evolutionary biologist Stuart Kauffman, and I'm quoting from his book The Origins of Life,
okay,
says that the emergence of the self-replicating DNA system seems to require its prior existence. And this is an insoluble dilemma for evolution. And that's why it doesn't get to first base, because if it can't explain the origin of DNA, it can't explain the origin of the first cell, and it can't explain the origin, therefore, of life at its beginning, why should we take its explanation for the existence of all living things to be credible when it can't even explain the existence of the first cell? What they're really saying is, give us one free miracle. Give us the first cell, and we'll take it from there. Now, the fellow that was challenging me offered the typically ludicrous evolutionary explanation. And he said, well, basically, deoxyribonucleic acid could have evolved from ribonucleic acid. What would happen is that the cell started to use some DNA instead of RNA. Really? Just like that?
Really? Right.
So RNA replication was somehow replaced by DNA replication because there was an accidental use of some DNA. None of this explains the incredible double helix, the amazing compactness with which genetic information is contained in the nucleus of a cell. I think if you unraveled the code, it would be 6 feet long. And yet it's coiled so tightly in the nucleus of a cell that it's all contained within a microscopic or even a submicroscopic nucleus. And so, according to them, this all happened through a series of random mutations beginning with the primordial soup. Come on, it's nonsense.
But where
anyone with any common sense knows that it's nonsense. They've never come up with an explanation.
Right. Well, and
the origin of the first cell.
And they could never explain also, where did the primordial soup come from?
Yeah, well, they can't explain the most fundamental question of all, why there is something rather than nothing. And I mean that on the basis of not just the domino theory, that some domino in the past set a chain of causation into motion, producing what we have today. No, I mean the existence of things from one moment to the next. They have no serious explanation for why anything should continue to exist. They can point to the things that do exist and say, well, this is what's happening in this particular organism or within this particular process. But they don't know why the electron has to revolve around the nucleus in the electron cloud posited by quantum mechanics. Why? Why should it have to do that? Why are there laws of nature? Who instituted these laws, or what instituted these laws? Why do you and I continue to exist from one moment to the next as bounded entities? Why is there a Mike Church that gets up in the morning and goes to bed at night? Why don't you just dissolve into your constituent parts? They have no idea why anything exists in terms of its first cause from one moment to the next. I once had a debate with a nuclear physicist. I met him on an airplane. We continued the debate by email. And I asked him such basic questions as, what was the first cause of your sending this last email to me? And he quickly realized where that was leading. It wasn't his hands typing. It wasn't his brain sending a signal to his hand. It wasn't some chemical reaction in his brain. What was the cause of the chemical reaction? He quickly realized that I was forcing him to admit that there must be an uncaused cause.
That's right.
For the existence of everything from one moment to the next. Otherwise, nothing would exist.
And this could go. You could take this argument all the way back to the time of Socrates, when Socrates was in jail cell and was about to be executed. Of course, the Athenians that were going to execute him realized that they were wrong, and they tried to undo it. And Socrates said, no, we need to have civil law and order, so you need to go ahead with your execution. I'm just going to kind of hang out here. And he was offered the chance to escape, and he didn't. But where this ties in is in one of Socrates' pupils asked him, well, why are you here? What are you doing here? And he said, well, I'm here because I'm seated because my hip joint relaxed, which is connected to this, and then this tendon relaxed, and then this one constricted, and then this one did this, and then, okay, now why did that one do this? Okay, well, that one did that because this. And the point that he was trying to make is I could sit here and I could explain that and keep going from now until forever. I would never be out of contingencies. And
right, and there's one underlying cause that orchestrates the total ensemble of causes. So
That's
when
right.
I type a letter, it isn't an endless string of dominoes. There's one cause underlying everything that puts all of these secondary causes together into a human act.
That's right.
And this is so obvious. It's obvious as the nose on your face. And this is what evolutionists attempt to deny, and it leads to utter absurdity. Can I jump back to one of my counterfactuals? I mean, I love these things. They show in a common sense way how silly the theory of evolution is. Here's another example in nature. The leafcutter ants. Now, this is a species of ant which exhibits communal behavior, tightly integrated, amazingly coordinated, just like the beavers do. Only it's even more amazing. You have these ants that climb up into trees, and some of the ants, when they climb up to these trees, use their mandibles to cut the leaves loose from the trees, which flutter to the ground. Then other ants carry the leaves off to the ant colony. And there, they combine the leaves with a certain fungus that digests the leaves into a mulch. And then the mulch, is ingested as the food that sustains the colony. These ants are engaged in farming activity. Now, what were they doing during the millions of years when this activity was supposedly evolving? Were they not feeding themselves in some manner? And if they were feeding themselves in some manner while this curious farming behavior evolved, why did they need to evolve the farming behavior? They could just have gone on feeding themselves by whatever they found in nature, on the ground, or wherever. There's no possible plausible explanation for the evolution of this kind of communal behavior on the part of these ants. It defies evolutionary explanation.
Boy, doesn't it? I tell you what, that's about all the time we have for this episode. But I tell you what I'd like to do with episode 4, Darwin Was Wrong. We started this episode when I asked you the question of, was this the worst of all heresies? Was this the philosophy that resulted from Darwin's theory of evolution, was it the worst? And you answered yes, and you explained why. I would like to actually solicit and maybe gather some of the resulting errors that have occurred and dissect them one by one, because they are popularly still with us. And many of the things that we accept as foregone conclusions today, as part of the modern world and as part of modern thinking, are as a result of this particular error. And I think it's important to show why these errors have to be corrected. They have to be snuffed out in the cradle before they can metastasize. and then result in the rest of the errors that we have. For example, and just one that I just happen to know off the top of my head, around the time that Darwin is doing his dastardly deed and is concocting this, men are still engaging in war and in warlike activities in a manner that is somewhat regulated and somewhat tempered by what St. Augustine would have called, and those that came after St. Augustine would have called just war. You know, even the pagans had a concept of just war. But by the time Darwin is finished, and by the time that man is now king and there is no creator and man's harnessed the atom, we've got all the way down to the atom, and we can basically make our own rules up, we have just entirely and totally jettisoned any concept of just war and have now made implements and machines and armaments that are now capable of killing in a very short period of time more men in battle or in warlike activities, again, in a very short period of time, that would exceed all those that had been previously killed in all wars combined.
Well, the theory of evolution has contributed to what one commentator has called the deprivileging of humanity. If we're just one of many organisms on an evolutionary continuum, then man is nothing special, and this is what
That's
the atheists tell us. Man is nothing special, the earth is nothing special. Humanity becomes deprivileged, and these atheists desperately try to say, well, you can maintain morality without maintaining a transcendent dimension in man, but they fail because they reduce man to an animal, moreover, an evolving animal that isn't even possessed of a distinct nature. And in the next episode, I want to discuss also the problems for revelation that are posed by the theory of evolution, and how we have to remember the principle that revelation is primary. Theology is the mother of all the other sciences.
That's right.
Theology doesn't respond to science. Science responds to theology. If there really were a conflict between true scientific data and a theological proposition, the theological proposition would be adjusted accordingly if it were possible. But when you're talking about the fine dogmas of the faith, such as special creation of Adam, creation of Eve from Adam, it is impossible for science legitimately to contradict what God has definitely revealed. So if there's a conflict between a revealed truth definitively and dogmatically defined by the church and a so-called claim by science, the claim by the scientist must yield. It obviously can't be true because there can be no conflict between right reason and faith. The two are compatible. Therefore, there must be a problem with the scientific theory.
Must be.
That's what we should explore in the next episode.
We will, and that's a great preview. As always, Chris Ferrara, thank you for your time, and thanks for the continual learning that we're all gaining from this series, The Modern Wrong World Made Right, and especially from this one, the third episode of Darwin Was Wrong. We'll see you in a couple of weeks on Darwin Was Wrong Part 4, my friend.
Looking forward to it.
Yes, sir. So am I. So, folks, this is Mike Church here for Chris Ferrara, signing off. And remember, you can get all 4 episodes of Darwin Was Wrong, or all 3 episodes, rather, of Darwin Was Wrong in the Founders Pass media player at VeritasRadioNetwork.com. It is a streaming download available to all members, and you can download all 3 episodes in their entirety, and you can start to make a collection. We'll see you in a couple of weeks again here for the next installment of Darwin Was Wrong. It'll be part 4, part of the Veritas Radio Network and the Crusade Channel's original series, The Modern Wrong World Made Right. Until then, may God love you and keep you. God bless. Have a blessed day, and we'll see you soon.